Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled, Who Has the Body? Mapping and Preserving the History of African American Cemeteries. Our leader for this session is Nishani Frazier, Director of Public History, Department of History, North Carolina State Universities. Tonight's TAs, who are also members of our Teacher Advisory Council, Nick Kennedy and Jody Fernandez. It's awesome to see you both here. I see that Nick has already gotten a jump on his post, so we appreciate you, but thank you to you both for the work that you're doing in our Teacher Advisory Council and also for the support that you consistently give us. Nishani Frazier is Professor of History and Director of Public History at North Carolina State University. Prior to North Carolina State University, she was a faculty member at Miami University of Ohio and the University of Kansas. Professor Frazier has also held professional public history positions as Associate Curator of African American History and Archives at Western Reserve Historical Society, Assistant to the Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Archives at the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and personal assistant for Dr. John Hope Franklin before and during his tenure as chair of President Bill Clinton's Advisory Board on One America. Her research interests include 1960s freedom movements, oral history, museum studies, archives and public history, Black nationalist philosophy, digital humanities, and Black economic development. Nishani's publication, Harambe City, The Congress of Racial Equality in Cleveland and the Rise of Black Power Populism, was released with an accompanying website also titled Harambe City. The website is a digital project that creates a second layer of book reading via online access to maps, archival documents, teacher lesson plans, and oral history interviews. Frazier's writings also include co-editor for Freedom of My Mind, the Columbia Documentary History of the African American Experience, a policy paper for Democracy Collaborative, A New Direction, Community Wealth Building Black Community Then and Now, Next System, co-authored essay, Blackness is Not the Absence of Light, Restoring Black Visibility and Liberation of Digital Humanities in Debates in Digital Humanities, and multiple publications in Black Perspectives, AMSG, blog, Truth Out, and more. And currently, she also serves as editor for the American Studies Journal. Upcoming publications include Sounds of Blackness and Bloomberg's Oral History Reader. Professor Frazier is currently working on a tasty new book titled Cooking with Black Nationalism. Nishani, Dr. Frazier, it is indeed an honor and a privilege to have you here tonight, and we so look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're so very welcome.
All right, I'm ready to start whenever you are.
Okay, good deal, good deal. Well, the mic and the slides are yours.
All right. So, when Michael said, "Who got the body?" I have to say that was my original title. And then I thought, okay, my country girl is coming out, right?
Yeah.
In Black communities, we say, "Who got the body?" And so I'm going to put a little question in the chat there. I've seen where everybody's coming from, but when someone asks in your community, "Who has the body?" right? What do they mean? Which group has the body? So in Durham, North Carolina, if we say "Who got the body?" More often than not, you hear Scarborough, right? Which is one of the oldest Black-owned funeral homes, founded in 1871. So if you all have a well-known Black funeral home like that, you can put that in along with your location. I see Mike has put in R.H. Green Funeral, right? Who got the body, right? It's one of those terms that is pretty much ubiquitous in Black culture and in the Black community. It allows us to recognize both the cultural and communal components that connect us together. But history doesn't often embrace these kinds of aspects of studying human beings, right? We don't like to deal with spiritual dimensions, even though culture, and spiritual dimensions inform the human experience, especially when it comes to the question of death. And in the African American historical experience in particular, these discussions of death can take on both cultural and mystical functions. Carla Holloway articulates the role of death in Black culture in her book, Passed On. And in the book, she argues that African Americans have a particular vulnerability to an untimely death in the United States. And when she means untimely death, she means massacres, lynching, these kinds of circumstances and incidents, right? When she says that, what she's trying to articulate is the way there's a kind of collective cultural memory in which Black death is haunting, right? And that Black life is persistently interrupted by the specters of death, right? When Black death is interrupted, who got the body actually ends up having a double meaning in the context of Black cemeteries especially, because who got the body or who has the body is actually a contested issue. In this session, what I'm going to do is talk about this other side of who got the body, and talk about the more unsavory ways that that phrase reflects the ways that Black life can be denigrated even in the afterlife. Now, I have to be honest and say a couple of things before I move forward. You heard my whole bio, all right? A.D. Price and RVA, is that who got the body in your community, Annie? Inglewood Cemetery. I just wanted to stop and make sure I was looking at who might have the body in your community. And as everyone is continuing to share, I just want to sort of tell on myself a little bit. So when you heard my bio, at no point did I say, oh, I study cemeteries, because I don't. It is, me and death are not friends by any means. And in a lot of ways, I have been pushed and prodded into the study of Black cemeteries, some of which I didn't realize I was doing before, right, the study of death. But it became more and more apparent as I took on my new position as director of the public history program at North Carolina State University. But to give you a sense of what I mean when I say death and I are not friends, when I was working with Dr. Franklin, just to give you an anecdote, we had a conversation, and somehow in the midst of this conversation, the sort of subject of his demise, he was elder at that point, the subject of his demise came up, and I was unhappy that particular conversation was emerging. And before I could stop myself, I told Dr. Franklin that it was unacceptable for him to die. And Dr. Franklin told me, well, girl, that's not how it works. And my response was, well, you die when I tell you to. So unfortunate for me, he did not listen to me. And that is the nature of death. That's how death operates. And again, I kind of avoided this kind of conversation around death. So when I became director of the public history program at North Carolina State, I was a little bit nonplussed when I started to receive students in our program who talked about death a lot. And in fact, a lot of their work was centered around, I know, stubborn man, how dare he not do what I say. A lot of their work was centered around Black cemetery preservation. And we had so many students, I thought it was really quite interesting. Kiwana Coleman was the first student I met like that, Katie Boatner, a number of students studying Black cemeteries in particular. But I still felt disinclined to sort of engage this subject matter, even though we as a program are incredibly concerned with history and memorialization. And more importantly, we are absolutely a group, right, that is guided by an unapologetic approach to advocacy and public policy. So we don't shy away from engaging systems that act against history or act to undermine telling historical truths. But the truth of the matter is, I had a past that was filled with dealing with death, right? My original work was as an archivist, which is all about engaging people in organizing their personal papers of people who passed away. My first published essay was Die for the People, in the prophesying tradition among Black leaders like King and Malcolm X and Fred Hampton. And I'm making an argument that they had the ability to prophesy their own deaths, which was part of a recurring comment and mythos among African American activists, that they knew that their death was coming. And then again, I was also coming to this question of death, even in futuristic kinds of ways, through my colleague Brian Carter at the University of Arizona, who asked me to work with him on creating an AI of Marcus Garvey. And as I began to sort of think about what this project would look like, it occurred to me that, in a sense, we were engaged in a process of resurrecting the dead, right? And so one way or another, right, I was dealing with this question of death, even though I was avoiding the language of death studies or studying cemeteries. But I was more driven into this work, not by sort of the generalities of history, but my own angry spirit. And a lot of that angry spirit came in succession, right? In the first year, and the first few months, actually, of my time as director of the public history program. One of the ways I could feel that sort of angry spirit coming out is when I had a chance to visit Geer Cemetery in Durham, North Carolina. It is the African American cemetery of the main founders of Black Durham, including founders of North Carolina Central University, some of the oldest churches. But the cemetery had suffered from many years of neglect by the county, and it showed not only in terms of the headstones, but in the overall care of the cemetery itself. And as I walked through the cemetery, I could feel myself getting angry, in part because I also knew that the way Black cemeteries were treated, there was a likelihood that the road that was running alongside Geer Cemetery was likely utilized for a grave space and remains as well, but infrastructure took over and, in fact, was not respectful of the fact that the cemetery was larger than what it appeared. And so I could feel a kind of righteous anger coming up in that moment. As soon thereafter, I actually met Ms. Deborah Gonzalez, who's one of the many community people that I've worked with, and who's been an incredible guide in helping me to learn, right, to help me engage in this whole question of preservation and protection of Black cemeteries. And I'd have to say, perhaps the most angering moment that I had with regard to Black life came under the circumstance of the bones of children from the organization of MOVE. MOVE was a Black organization that had been effectively attacked by city police during the 1980s, and members of the community were surrounded, and in an attempt to push them out or to get them out of the building, incendiary devices were set off, and the building caught on fire. The result was that there were a number of people who were killed, including children. What was upsetting, however, is that the remains of the children had not been returned to the parents, and in fact had been sent to various institutions to be studied and examined as part of a forensic course. And if you can see in that first image is actually a study that took place which examined how the remains had been treated. And as you can see, there was a professor who was handling these remains. She actually knew, in fact, that the parents wanted the remains back. And there's a lot of contestation about, whether there a real effort that was made. And from the members of MOVE, their position was there was no effort made. And even if it was, it was totally illegitimate to use the tragedy, right, of the burning of the house and the killing of those children for study and to be handled in the way in which they were handled. And what was most interesting at the end of the study, it notes that her retention and use of the remains at 14 as demonstrative of artifact did not, I want to repeat that, did not violate the museum's policy statement on human remains. What that means, however, is not just that African Americans, children and their bones somehow didn't fit. It was simply that there was no policy that applies specifically to how remains of African Americans were treated. There is one for Native Americans, right? The Native American Grave Protection Act, NAGPRA, as well known, requires that all institutions repatriate funerary objects and remains back to the community. But in the case for African Americans, we don't have a receiving agent, right, in the same sense that allows for the return. And so it allowed Penn, which is the institution where the professor taught, to effectively utilize those remains. And it just enraged me. There's no polite way to say it, right? It engendered in me a major angry spirit at the ways in which Black people continue to be denigrated, right, in the afterlife. And so what occurred to me was that what was happening is that there were kind of two kinds of death that was emerging when it came to African American afterlife. And one of those deaths centered on a kind of sense in which remains were always contested, right? Remains could always be moved or transitioned and or not even located properly and cared for. And it reminded me, quite frankly, of an exhibit that was done in the early 90s and that became a subsequent book. And the exhibit was of lynching postcards, but one of the most compelling aspects of that particular exhibit was the phrase, "Even dead, the victims were without sanctuary." And that without sanctuary continues to sit with me. That's that part that brings out my angry spirit, right? That there is no sanctuary after the racism, after the discrimination, after the working hard and hard life experiences that many African Americans face, right? That death, as we had imagined it, that was supposed to be a balm, right, for the spirit, was not for the body. And so even in death, right, the bodies were without sanctuary. And part of this emanates from a number of reasons, right, that there is not this sanctuary. Some of it coming from the Black experience associated with violent outbreaks. For example, the most well-known in North Carolina is the Wilmington 1898 massacre. And here you see is a map that was constructed to help us understand how the massacre unfolded. The map is an image produced by the Cape Fear Museum. And actually, Professor Tara White, who's at the University of Wilmington, is currently working with the community there. What is not unique, and unfortunately, is that in the case of massacres, after the mass killings take place, bodies are placed haphazardly in different spaces. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, there were assertions from the community that the remains were placed in, large pits. In the case of Wilmington, there was recurrent testimony that the remains had been thrown into the Cape Fear River, right? And so the sense of how many people was always contested. There was always a question about how many people were killed in this massacre. And because there was no process, right, of burial, this whole question then of being without sanctuary, right, was centered around the untoward ways in which Black people died during this period, like the violent ways that Black people died during this period. And this is not the only case or circumstances where this occurs, right? We also have circumstances that involve what we would consider the death of the forgotten. Convict laborers, for example, have been found convict laborer cemeteries have been found in places like Texas and Mississippi, all across the South. And these spaces, of course, have not been protected, akin to a potter's field, also spaces that are not protected because these are people who are poor. These are people who are considered outside the respectability, right, accorded to citizens and people within society. And so we ignore the fact that there was a continual problem of injustice in the Black experience, including in terms of law enforcement and the way in which the criminal justice system treated African Americans. And so this extension of disrespect, this extension of exclusion from society then extended into the forgotten in terms of these cemetery spaces. One example of this is you can see in South Carolina. I'm sorry, we jumped here. Well, hold on one second. We're going to get back. There we go. One of these cases is in South Carolina. A number of these locations that were considered unknown potter's fields, for the most part, the majority of them are disproportionately African American. In this particular location, there are over 26,000 remains believed to be in the middle of Charleston. And so obviously much of Pottersfield was paved over and buildings and various edifices were put on top of these spaces. There is an effort now in South Carolina, in Charleston, to reassert, right, the memory that poverty should not be a basis by which to disregard, right, the sanctity of life and by extension, the sanctity of death. And these kinds of circumstances are not just a function of being forgotten or a function of massacre. In its current formulation, it also takes a form by institutions and entities that effectively treat African American remains as irrelevant or unimportant. And so in this particular case, right, we're getting into the second form of the experience of the African American afterlife, and that's what I call the disrupted homegoing. So we have first sort of what it means to be without sanctuary, a place to be rested, right? But in this particular, and forgotten as a result, but in this particular case, in the more current formulations, disrupted homegoings tends to be associated with the way that institutions, right, operate to displace African American cemeteries. University of Georgia, for example, discovered a cemetery of enslaved people and secretly reburied the remains so that they could build a building on the former cemetery site. The image you're looking at now is Shockoe Hill. It's the African burial ground in Richmond, Virginia, and it's the largest burial ground for Black Virginians beginning in the early 1800s, right? It was established by free Black Richmonders who petitioned to have a new cemetery. The descendants have done extensive research on this site, which they believe to have spanned close to 31 acres, and is believed to have more than 22,000 bodies buried across the site. But if you take a look at this map of what is supposed to be Shockoe Cemetery, you'll notice there's a big old highway running right through it. And this is actually not unusual. The Department of Transportation, state departments of transportation have been particularly notorious for disrupting homegoings, disrupting the cemetery, so that even when there was a space that had been protected, that had been secured by African American communities and families, it was pushed aside, right, for infrastructure. And so we have death by institutions like University of Georgia, like the Department of Transportation, but you also have death by developers. And developers at this current point are the most notorious, right? And they're particularly notorious now in the Raleigh-Durham area because of the massive influx of population coming into North Carolina. And so the focus is on building more and more and more housing. And in the process, there are overturning these remains. And there are consistent efforts to diminish the value, right, the historical value of these sites, on the basis, on the idea that this is halting progress, right? This is halting the development of the area. What you're looking at now is actually not North Carolina. We will get to that or focus on North Carolina, but in this case, this is in Virginia, Mecklenburg County, Virginia. And in this particular circumstance, the authorities actually helped suppress the presence of the Black cemetery because they wanted to give Microsoft the space to create or house a data center. And so as you can see, they went through various circumstances of ignoring the correct process for engaging and locating descendants. Instead, they put a little notice in the newspaper, in the classified, and nobody actually picks up a newspaper, as we know. They put a notice in that newspaper, and that's all they had to do to say that they had done a proper notification. And the next thing the descendants knew, Microsoft had a data center sitting on top of their cemetery. And so this whole continuation, right, of disrupting African American life has shown itself not just in past behavior, right, with the Department of Transportation and the highway system or University of Georgia from many, many years ago, but even in the current circumstance. Most recently, and I'll put a pause here to take questions after this particular part. Most recently, we had a circumstance where Virginia University put a sign, I don't know how well you can see the sign, VCU Health, which was an advertisement next to the Shockoe Hill African American burial ground. Now, this caused a great deal of offense, and part of the reason it caused a great deal of offense is because VCU had become notorious at the turn of the century for grave robbing African American remains, including remains from Shockoe Hill Cemetery. During the turn of the century, if you wanted to examine bodies, this was considered illegal in most states. And so medical colleges from Virginia to Georgia would pay people to locate cadavers or take cadavers from potter's fields, from African American cemeteries, so that they could study the remains in medical colleges. And then, as soon as they could, they would get rid of the remains. In fact, VCU found some remains dumped in an old well. The Medical College of Georgia, same thing. They stumbled across some bones when they were starting to build a new college building. In this case, it was estimated 10,000 bones that were recovered from the basement of their old medical college. So what I want us to understand before we move into North Carolina and why we're doing the work of preservation is, what are the complications and the difficulties that make it a really rough road for African Americans to do preservation work, to do historical work when it comes to Black cemeteries? But I also think it was important for you to understand that part of the reason that I do this work, even though it is not, quote, as an academic, my field, is because in a lot of ways, these kinds of offenses to Black people is, for me, engendered a kind of angry spirit and a righteously angry spirit that drives me to do the work of preservation. So we'll talk in a minute about sort of how this came about in terms of North Carolina State University itself, and how we went from my angry spirit to actually doing work on preservation of Black cemeteries. But I'll pause right quick, Mike, just to take some questions.
Okay, good deal, and thank you so much. Again, I remind everyone, if you should have any questions, I see a few questions in the audience chat. Please feel free to enter them in the managed Q&A, and we will definitely bring them to Dr. Frazier's attention. One question, and you spoke to this a little bit earlier, was about Black cemeteries and the role that they play in, say, for instance, social, cultural, and spiritual lives of the African Americans or the Black community. But particularly during periods of segregation, could you speak to the role of the Black cemetery during those periods of time, and whether that same sense of social, cultural, and spiritual significance remains today? So could you speak more to the role of that the Black cemeteries play in social, culture, and spiritual lives of African Americans, particularly during periods of segregation?
Sure. So African American burial spaces certainly are not unusual, even during slavery. Unfortunately, of course, remains were placed where required or designated by the enslaver. But in the post-Reconstruction period, one of the first ways that African Americans began to engage in mutual aid and benefit societies was around burials, right? That they wanted to ensure that there was a proper support system, a proper respect paid to the remains of African Americans. And so they immediately formed mutual aid societies, particularly around burials, and churches also became an initial site for setting aside land for African American cemeteries. Now, in some cases, you also had African American cemeteries that were associated with family or family plots. And those family plots could be attached to land, and or those family plots could be attached to the broader community. This is what happens, of course, with Shockoe Hill, is that the whole community is assigned this huge amount of acreage for the burial needs of the Black community in Virginia. It's the same case also in places like Princeville, and I'll talk about Princeville soon, where the African American community has gathered together to provide their own support systems, their own spaces for doing burial in the ways that reflects the spirit of of the Black community culturally and religiously. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of what that looks like in detail, how that expresses itself in terms of cultural expression, in terms of objects and artifacts and plant vegetation and things like that. But I think it's important to understand that that's central to the Black experience. That's essential to the Black community formations, right? This question of how do we protect and respect the dead.
All right, good deal. Thank you so much. Supreet had a question pretty early on when you were talking about the public exposure of the remains. His question was, what was the purpose behind using the remains to show in the public? It was during your initial slides, you made reference to that, and he was wondering like if there was an underlying purpose for actually having those remains exposed and open to public view.
So to be clear, I'm not sure what that's a reference to. There are remains that were coming, for example, in Deer Street that were being exposed. And so that was not something that was intentional. That was because of the problem of neglect. And I will say that with regard to public access to remains, the more recurring problem came around medical colleges and universities who were taking remains. And I should say, VCU was also known to sell remains to other medical colleges. So it actually behooves a lot of these early institutions to not just look for remains associated with Native Americans, but also remains associated with African Americans, particularly given how they managed to obtain the bodies.
All right. Good deal. Thank you for that. And again, I remind everyone, if you have any additional questions, please enter them in the managed Q&A. In the interest of time, we're going to move on. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Frazier.
So the question is, how did North Carolina State University get involved in African American afterlife, right? From the sort of previous portion, you can see I was kind of drag kicking and screaming into this process. This was not something that by any means I thought, oh, I know what I'll do when I become head of this program, right? In my mind, I had envisioned doing historical sites and oral history interviews, particularly with a focus on Mr. and Mrs. Murray, very well-known African-American educators in the Black community and the cross-link children. I had a whole vision. None of this included death studies or African-American cemeteries. However, at the start of fall of 2023, I believe, we started to do some research in my gentrification class. And as we were doing this research in my gentrification class, this conversation emerged from a particular book about the Research Triangle Park. And I'm actually going to jump back just a little bit to allow you guys to see on the second image, if you can see it, you'll note a reference toward the bottom where it says there's an estimated number of graves that runs from 30 to 60. And it's graves that we believe associated with Negro slaves and their descendants. This is actually one of the grave sites that was in the Research Triangle Park before it became the sort of meta industrial bio, technology space that has become currently. And my students were really fascinated at this question of what happened to the remains. And as it turned out, as we did a little bit of research, what we learned was that the remains had been pulled together, different remains had been pulled together of African-American cemeteries. And that is because of the RTP area, Research Triangle Park area, previously was an area of a Black community. And so they took remains from various spaces, and then they put it in a location that they thought was unbuildable. And that location is currently on the grounds of IBM, which has recently been sold to another developer out of Houston. And as we were doing this research, it became clear that part of the difficulty of locating this cemetery was that there was no public information about it at all. It was a lone quote in a book that my students, sort of got drawn to, that then set us in this direction of doing research to find out, exactly what happened to these enslaved peoples and their remains. And we eventually learned that the United States Department of Transportation had conducted a survey of that cemetery, Pinewood Cemetery, and they had conducted a survey because they decided that that land was not any longer unbuildable, that they would instead use that spot as a location for a light rail into the Research Triangle Park. And so my students and I, once again, were appalled. And that was my first introduction to Melissa Timo, who is director of North Carolina State Archaeology Department. Now, little did I know that just that inquiry would lend itself to a huge beginning process for the department and for the program in the study and protection of African American cemeteries. So in the course of that year, what started off as a conversation in a classroom in October, by fall of 2024 had become over 10 sites where we had received requests for either help with memorialization. Oh, there's Katie Boatner. I see her. She's one of our students. She's doing the African American section of Raleigh City Cemetery. But anyway, over 10 sites of these locations were people who needed help. We'd also done outreach to Congresswoman Alma Adams' office, because she was a co-sponsor for the African American Heritage Preservation Bill that was focused primarily on cemeteries. And so through these exchanges and interactions, we began to build a community of people who had various needs, various concerns. And I'll talk about those various ways in which our program has operated to support these spaces. But it includes, I say North Carolina, Virginia border, because when I tell you it was all the way somewhere, as we say, in the country. And so I couldn't tell you a city because I'm not sure there was a city. Anson County, I still have to follow up with the contact there. We've been working with Princeville, and Princeville has been in conjunction with Professor Kofi Boone, who's done a lot of work on Black cemetery preservation in Princeville. We have spaces in Durham and Wendell, North Carolina, and Hillsborough, Greensboro, Chapel Hill. The Lincolnville community has been particularly upset because their cemetery is right next to the stadium at North Carolina State University. And so there's been a consistent problem of refuse and trash in the cemetery, and a problem of sort of lack of upkeep and treatment of the cemetery, particularly during game time and things like that. So, as I said, in 1 year, we had started with one question, and by the end of the fall year, we had over 10 plus locations. We'd also did a symposium trying to work through the number of students who were doing work on what we call death studies, and to work through how we could provide assistance to African American cemeteries. And it took multiple forms. In Princeville, a good portion of the support that they needed was around both historicizing and preservation. If you know anything about Princeville, it's the first African American unincorporated town in the United States and in the state of North Carolina. And one of the major problems they have is the location of the town is in low-lying areas and highly prone to flooding. And because they're prone to flooding, there have been multiple problems with maintaining and sustaining the cemetery. But Hurricane Floyd, and then followed by Hurricane Matthew, was a traumatic and tragic event where massive flooding led to the displacement of the cemetery, including headstones and caskets, actually literally floating up in the flooding water. Add the whole question of the age of the cemetery, again, because it dates back into the 1800s. And what you have is a lot of difficulty in documenting the location and the number of remains that have been on the site. At this point, one of the things, for example, they have to do is they have to find ways to replace the use of cinder blocks as a tool of marking remains with something that's more permanent, but at the same time, not susceptible to displacement should there be flooding. In addition, what they want to do is do heritage preservation of the cemetery and give it a historical designation that will, again, support efforts toward preservation and sustaining and keeping the space, the upkeep of that space. So one of the things that we're going to be helping them do is follow in the work of Ms. Deborah Gonzalez and Gear Street Cemetery and figuring out a process of getting them the designation of a national state heritage site and a national heritage site. In addition to preservation work, we also focus, and this is all, as far as we're concerned, an extension of public history work. What we do is advocacy, and as I say, unapologetic advocacy. What we do is focus on the ethics and the importance of history and the public's engagement with history. What we do is preservation. In this particular case, the Chapel Hill site has been a site not of preservation, but of advocacy. In this particular circumstance, there is a cemetery that was designated for African Americans. And the cemetery was cordoned off by a black fencing. However, it was clear from the start that the fencing actually did not reflect the true size of the cemetery. And a survey that was conducted by Chapel Hill confirmed that 60% of the black cemetery was outside the gate. So in other words, right, what the visual representation was, in fact, did not reflect at all the actual true size of the cemetery. And this is one of the things that we are learning about African American cemeteries. There is a tendency to grossly undercount the amount of remains that are in these spaces, and there are different reasons for that. One of the reasons is the fact that in some cases, because of limitation of space, some of the remains are in fact buried in a stacked sort of position. The other issue, of course, is that in some spaces of black cemeteries, there are sections that are cordoned off specifically for families, but that also means that the way the placement of the remains are in that particular space may not be in the kind of linear fashion that we normally expect a cemetery to be. The other thing with the Chapel Hill Cemetery is that part of it also constituted a potter's field. And I should add that potter's field sometimes had a tendency to also be closely related or adjacent to former older cemeteries, generally African-American cemeteries from enslaved remains, right? So that when we're looking at this space in Chapel Hill, it's not just that we're looking at this fence and we realize this is the cemetery is much bigger than that. is that we have no idea of the full scale of the cemetery. Part of that has been limited, however, because in the 1970s and 1980s, housing was built on top of the cemetery. And so that 60% that's outside of the fencing actually has housing on it. But the advocacy portion has come to play more recently because the city has agreed to allow a developer to utilize land adjacent to the cemetery for affordable housing. And of course, this caused a degree of outrage from the residents who were concerned about the housing. But it was soon a concern for descendants, African American descendants, when given the notification that yet another set of building would take place without a examination of the full remains and a study of the full remains outside of outside. Thank you, Nick Kennedy, for listing the Black Cemetery Network. And there are a number of organizations that do this work. I'll sidebar to point out Kennedy's statement. And because this has been a recurring national problem, the Black Cemetery Network is big. It's actually two groups, one that's out of Florida and another that's out of Virginia. At any rate, what happened, of course, is that we had to insist that Chapel Hill put a pause on the development so that we could actually follow through on their own survey and actually examine the area that they were building on, which resided next to the cemetery. And it was, these are the kinds of things that are difficult conversations to have. There were expectations that the city would get moving along and building this affordable housing. They had concepts of utilizing tax breaks and a timetable. And so this certainly created complications and questions about the ability to move forward with this affordable housing when there were questions about the status of African American remains or the possibility of African American remains outside of the fence. So it remains one of these issues, complicated issues that they're having to work through. I don't have that problem. They now have that problem because the bottom line is that state law does not allow for you to build on top of the remains of a cemetery. So that means that, until we can examine that space and ensure that that space is not a continuation of the Black cemetery, that there will be no building. We will not continue, as the descendants were in that meeting pointed out, to be disrespectful of Black people both in life and in death. The African burial ground, I see Jody Fernandez has mentioned that, is an amazing example of a Black cemetery that was found. Over 17,000 remains. There's a national monument there. Howard University actually did some examination of some of those remains to study and get a deeper understanding of the life, physical, and health experience of Black residents in New York. I'm going to pause just a little bit here and make sure that I don't skip any questions.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a few questions that have come in. One question was about North Carolina laws. And Lillian's question is, North Carolina laws do not protect nor enforce protection of people before or after death. Her question is, do you believe race plays a role? Or if race is a determining factor as it directly relates to those, lack of protections?
So I want to clarify a couple of things. There's lack of protections, not because there's not a law. There are lack of protections because people don't feel they have to respect the Black cemeteries. That's why there's no protection. The state actually requires that if you find any remains, you must immediately stop and call the State Department of Archaeology so they can examine the remains, particularly for historical relevance. This actually was a case with a Native American grounds on the coast where a developer who had spent a lot of money trying to get this resort started to run into the remains of Native communities along the coast. However, the way this works is that the developers claim that they have someone who comes in who cannot find, this is the language that you use, they cannot find any indication that remains are present. So, for example, in Chapel Hill, the developer claimed that they had examined the space outside of the cemetery and had noted that they did not find any kind of objects that indicated under the ground. We use ground penetration radar, which is a piece of equipment that basically looks like a lawnmower, and it allows you to determine if there's any kind of displacement underground. And of course, that displacement can be tree roots. It can be any number of things, but often we utilize it for determining if there are spaces where we call a burial shaft, right? Open spaces in the land that indicate that there is something there. In the case of North Carolina, what sometimes happens is that because the soil is acidic, you won't often find remains, although the burial shaft makes it clear that there was someone there. And what's left is small amounts of genetic material, small artifacts like the classes or things like that, which are hard to sort of locate just simply through using the ground penetration radar. It's the burial shaft that we're looking for. But the way the developer in Chapel Hill tried to get around the issue or the question was by noting that there wasn't any objects that they ran into. And this is wordplay that is not unusual for developers to engage in. On the case of the coast of North Carolina, they claimed that there were no burial shafts, and then they claimed that the artifacts that they found were not of historical relevance. And the problem is, if someone is not looking over their shoulder, then they can, construct a report as they see fit to basically discount the value of any particular space of remains. And I should tell you that particular site on the coast turned out to be the largest find of Native American artifacts since the 1980s in the state of North Carolina. And now the developer has been forced to stop building along the coast. And it turns out that set of artifacts and remains stretches along the coast, right, for miles. So I hope that answers your questions. But it's a long-winded version of we have laws. But like all laws, people have to obey them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yolanda's question, to your point, are these quote-unquote experts just anyone the developer finds, or is there a pool of people who they must use? Are they special certifications or special requirements to qualify as the developer's experts?
Yes. So there are companies and corporations that use ground penetration radar that are brought in to examine the space to ensure that there is no archaeological remains or artifacts that then allows the developer to then move forward. But now keep in mind, it's the developer who pays them. So that makes for a complicated narrative. They are not required, for example, to report to the Department of Archaeology and say, do you have a list of people that we can bring in who have worked with the department before and who can do an examination of the space, right? Intentionality here is important.
All right. Good deal. Thank you. We'll take one more. Lana's question is it's a personal question. She mentioned that the grandfather who's buried in Griffin, Georgia, However, when they went to the cemetery where he was supposed to be, he couldn't find his grave because most of the graves are unmarked. In your experience, when you run across those, are there any particular techniques, strategies, or approaches that you or your team or any of the experts that you work with use to better understand the placement of those unmarked graves, or if there's a way to cross-reference to determine where they're located?
So yes, that's an excellent question. And actually, what I'm going to do is kind of skip over to the education part and the ways that we work with students, because that will help in answering some of the questions about the process and how we go about the process. I'll skip our discussion about advocacy and the ways that we do policy making. This is with Pineless. This is talking about what does it mean to do our work. So a lot of the work that we end up doing comes in as individual requests. So we have people who have now come to learn of the work that we do around genealogy research, around historical research, and they contact us. We then work with our students to attempt to locate materials that will help us understand the history of that particular location. However, if I wanted to go about the process of locating Black remains, let's say without someone coming with a request, one of the things that I would do actually would be to go look at soil maps at the turn of the century. And soil maps are incredibly useful. If you go to the state of North Carolina digital map, you can actually pull up soil maps from different counties. And soil maps not only mark railroads, but they also mark locations of cemeteries or burial remains. And what's interesting is that you can tell where they're marking if it was a church or is there a church that is nearby, right? And then there are areas and locations where it seems to be in a location where there's not a certifiable institution or religious institution that is involved in the care of those burial remains. In North Carolina, the digital platform actually allows you to overlay a current map over the older soil map. So I have been able to ascertain a number of cemetery locations and sites, including two burial sites that were formerly under the Raleigh-Durham Airport, Terminal 2, as a matter of fact. But I've also found these spaces in other locations. So yes, there is a way to go about that process. The other thing is that wherever there is a large plantation, you can bet pretty much that there is a way to, or a location for African American remains of the enslaved. And they're actually identifiable through through the natural landscape. Right? So when we're not doing genealogy or historical research, we are kind of doing botany. So I'll just jump over to the botany here. And in doing the botany, what we've noticed about the landscape of enslaved burial remains and post-Civil War Reconstruction burial remains is that there's a tendency for burial remains to be in locations that are by ravines or by creeks, or by areas that were formerly bogs or really heavily wetland areas. We've also noticed that there are key vegetation that appears over and over again. Cedar trees are the most well-known of indicators. Now, of course, North Carolina has a sea of cedar trees everywhere. So we don't just look for a cedar tree and then say, oh, it must be a burial remain here, right? We look for other sort of environmental indications. Yucca plants, for example, also an indication. Miss Deborah has helped introduce me, and my god sister, who is a master gardener. I bring her around to every cemetery that I have to go to because I can't recognize a plant on a good day or a bad day. That is just not my God-given talent. um, and so it allows me to bring in people like Ms. Deborah, like my god sister, who can identify other vegetation that indicates remains. So the yucca plants, cedar trees. One thing I have noticed, and again, this is working with my students in a number of locations that we assume are related to the Gullah cultural burial practice, seashells. And I have actually seen seashells at burial sites. So that is a testament to the fact that this idea of using seashells to mark a space is not just specific to the coastal communities or to the Gullah communities. There are other indications, daffodils, periwinkle, there's a whole list of plants that serve as indicators. There's also an indication that they're in, again, not spaces that are intended to be like, the, Arlington Cemetery, right? It's not going to be green and, in a natural row with grass and that kind of thing. You have to remember that in a lot of cases, especially for enslaved people, these are people who are buried in places that are not utilized for growing food or growing something. So they're not the best of locations for burial remains. It simply is the location furthest from both the plantation house and particular sort of usage of the land for agricultural crops and development. I hope that answers your question. As a historian, I talk a lot, so you might have to stop me.
That's all good. That was perfect. Thank you. Thank you. We can continue on. Thank you.
So we got about 15 minutes, so I'm just going to sort of move it along very quickly. And I know I'm jumping around. I appreciate your patience here. So we have found, and I have found, right, through these various requests that our educational ability, our ability to educate our students has expounded exponentially. What we thought was eventually just going to be like research, right, has become so much more. The botany of death is just simply one component of that. Advocacy is another component. And I'm going to come back to this policy making, because one of the key things that we've tried to think about with Black cemeteries is how can we find a burial policy? How can we create a burial policy, right? And a burial policy that is similar to what we have in NAGPRA, a policy that allows for the protection, right, literal and figurative insurance against destruction and abuse of Black remains. And the issues, right, require a bit of investigation, in part because with NAGPRA, there are designated locations and communities where funerary objects and remains can go. For African American remains and burial sites, that's not necessarily the case, right? And because we know that, things like infrastructure, highways and transportation tend to displace African American sites, when we are unable to provide levels of protection, we need to think about ways we can create spaces of what I call sacred sanctuary, right? Designated sites of relocation, right, that return the remains to the community with the clear intent, right, for setting a set of procedures, ethical procedures to ensure that the community remains the caretaker. But more importantly, that there's no more displacement. So some of the work that we've had to do is also sort of thinking about these community relationships that would allow us to locate spaces of sacred sanctuary for endangered African American burial remains, And when we are able to keep the spaces there, then we're working on ethics and advocacy and conducting historical research to help people understand more about the people who might possibly be in these spaces and the ways that we could potentially historicize and preserve those spaces. Our students have used any number of sources. We use newspapers. We use directories. We use census records, church records. Here, you're actually looking at the church records of Hephzibah Baptist Church from the early 1800s. A number of the people who attended this church actually owned slaves. And they required the slaves to also to attend the church. So what's incredible about these church records is, excuse me, that's my dog. What's incredible about these church records is that it gives us insight not only into the enslavers, but also the enslaved people. And so it's been an incredibly useful resource, particularly in trying to do historical research for the Wendell site. In addition to historical research in city directories and these type spaces, as I've talked about, we've looked at questions of botany as one other tool for thinking about how to identify locations and provide levels of protection. And then I think it's important that we center the voices of the people. And this has been our driving way of doing the work of preservation from our program. The voices of the people, in part, are the sort of site of who we serve and the site of our direction, right? We take our directions from them. They tell us what they need, and we do the best that we can to provide assistance. But in a lot of ways, we've all had to venture into a deeper understanding about Black spirituality and Black consciousness, right? We've had to study how spirituality can incorporate a full matrix of beliefs and power and values and behaviors that shape people's consciousness and their capacity, right, to reflect themselves in a divine, in divinity, right? One of the ways that we kind of call on the spirit when we enter these spaces is that we actually talk to the remains. And we engage the remains as if they are the living. And part of our ability to do this has to do with the Black cultural experience that I talked about, where that mystical is not out of reach, is not out of touch with the physical. And there are ways that we can individually, right, connect with the spirit, connect with the remains, and think about what is our role in this space, even when we do not have a community or descendants to help guide us. And this is, again, it's not unusual. There are many Black cultural mores that reflect this whole question of the unique relationship that we have to the divine, to spirituality, to death, right? And if you have time, because I know we're running short on time, maybe you can sort of write down some of the things that in your community you know are associated with death. One of those things, for example, you can see there on the left is a sparrow. And if you are from the South, you already know what I'm going to say, right? The moment a sparrow or a bird comes flying into your house, right, that is the indication that death is coming. One of the other elements is that death comes in threes. If you have a dream about a wedding, that could be an indication of death. And so in a lot of ways, right, this idea of sort of spiritual engagement and entering in the space in communion with the remains and with the descendants is not something sort of unique to the individual or their spirituality, is unique to the whole of the Black experience that allows us to have this deeper connection, this deeper relationship to the things that are unseen. And when we are in these spaces, these remains are not objects, they're not things, they are persons living and breathing to whom Black people are connected. And they're connected not by a word, right? Not by a voice, but by culture and spirit long after the body is gone. And so I will stop right there. I'll take a quick moment to thank our community leaders and collaborators who have been incredibly helpful in the work that we do. And if I have time, it's 8:24 for a question. I will take a question, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you so very much. And well, yeah, thank you for pointing out those I guess the superstitions as well, because growing up in the South, those are things you hear all the time, particularly with the death comes in threes and things like that. So I appreciate that. Carolyn had a question. You mentioned that the cedar trees or the pine trees that were planted near the cemetery, she wanted to know if they had any particular significance. Are the specific plants there, cedar trees, etc., because someone planted them to honor the buried person, or is there another reason?
Yes, so very quickly, the cedar trees that we tend to see are the ones that tend to do well in watery areas. So I think some of that has to do with literally a sensibility about environmental practice, that in order to protect the remains from dampness, that the trees prove very useful in adding sort of protection and keeping it as not as damp. The other thing is that there are ideas that artifacts like the bottles in the tree, like the spindly tree leaves, right? And I'm trying to think. Oh, you know what? Howling dog. That is another sign of death. So I'm sorry you all heard that. That is not a good thing there. But trees that seem to have a sort of pointy leaves are known or believed to keep away spirits. So these are some of the reasons for the indication for some particular vegetation.
All right, perfect. Thank you so very much for this evening, for your time, just your constant friendship and conversation. For those of you here, Nishani and I have had a chance on a number of occasions to have conversations, whether at the AP African American Studies conference or convening some years back, or just at the NHC where she brought over a few of her maps and we talked through some of the work that she was doing. So this is all remarkable work, and we appreciate you so very much. I look forward to our next conversation and discussing the ways that our work can continue to intersect, and think through the ways that we can support the work that you're doing. So we're so appreciative. And also shout out to your NC State colleagues who are in the chat tonight. I saw a few names who are popping up from NC State, as well as your students who are here. All right. Major props and love to the students who showed up this evening as well to support Dr. Frazier. Thank you again for joining tonight's session. I would encourage you all to keep up with all that's happening at the National Humanities Center via our various social media channels. As I mentioned earlier, we have an institute season, which is going to start in June. So if you are, in fact, interested in joining us in any of the institutes, please apply. In addition, if you're interested in joining the 2025-2026 Teacher Advisory Council, please submit your information and we will review it and get back to you. Support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects that they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. So if you will, consider a donation. We are a private nonprofit institution. Next up, February 25th at 7 o'clock p.m., we have Loki Mulholland, founder and executive director of the Joan Trumper Mulholland Foundation. And Joan Mulholland, she is in fact one of the freedom riders. If you look up her name, you will see that the work that she has done and just that level of courageousness that she has. And so her son, Loki, who's founder and executive director of her foundation, will be here next week for a session entitled Get Back to the Counter, 7 Lessons for Making a Difference. If you haven't already registered, please navigate to our site, registration page, and sign up. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Frazier for joining us this evening and giving us a thoughtful and insightful and illuminating overview of her research and the work that she's doing. And again, this work continues, and I can think of a number of ways that this work can translate to your classroom. So again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you all continue to stay safe. Have a great week, and I will see you back here next week. All right.